All right, greetings and welcome back to Sex, Race, and Class. I am your professor, Dr. Jonathan P. Grant, and today we are going to discuss chapter 1 in your textbook, Can't We All Just Get Along? Can't We All Just Get Along? So you should have read this already, and we're just going to go straight into it. So there is a story, right, that goes along with this title. And before we get into that, keep in mind that you can follow along with this if you have access to it now, is the PowerPoint. So we can follow along as we go over this chapter and this topic today. Can't we all just get along? So if we go here to this next slide, we ask ourselves, there was this question on that first slide, what was the first viral video, right? Essentially, what was the first viral video? And you all may be a little young, so you may not remember this. Maybe you've heard older brothers or sisters, or maybe your parents talk about this story. But there is a story of a man by the name of Rodney King. We're going to go back to that title, Can't We All Just Get Along? But there is a story of a man by the name of Rodney King. How many of you are familiar with the story of Rodney King? Right. Just think about it. If you are, then this is just a review. If you're not, then this is a story that will kind of shape your thinking and also give you color as to how we understand this whole notion of can't we all just get along. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you this, what happened with Rodney King, and then you can click on this video, this link, to get more information on it. But there was a gentleman, this happened, I believe, in 1990 or 1991. There was a gentleman by the name of Rodney King, and he was driving in a pretty nice neighborhood of Los Angeles. He had a pretty nice car. I think it was a red car, if I'm not mistaken. Pretty nice car, and he was driving in a nice neighborhood. He got pulled over by the police, and when the police pulled him over, they saw that he was inebriated. He was drunk, so he was driving under the influence, which is against the law. So the police had a right to pull him over. So when they pulled him over, they made him get out of the car. And when they made him get out of the car, they questioned him. And then all of a sudden, they started beating him and beating him mercilessly over and over and over and over and over again. And so this is something that was common and had happened a lot, particularly in the LA neighborhoods. And it was very evident, and this narrative existed within, particularly within rap music and hip hop music, as these young Black artists and these young Black rappers would talk about police brutality in their neighborhoods. Now, again, I said this was in the 1990s. I believe it was 1990 or 1991 when it actually occurred. And so this was a time way before camera phones, right? If you wanted to video record anything, there were these huge video recorders that you had to put on your shoulder in order to actually videotape something. So it was long before you had camera phones and videos on your phones. And so when these things were happening in these neighborhoods, particularly in poor neighborhoods and poor Black neighborhoods, um, most people just either didn't believe you, or it's hard for somebody to tell you something and it's different for you to see it. So even if you believe that these things were happening, because it was not visually in your face, most people just kind of let it go one ear and out of the other. So this was something that was actually pretty common in Los Angeles neighborhoods, but it didn't really hit the mainstream and it didn't really hit the populace until this happened. And the reason why this Rodney King incident was different was because, yes, the police were mercilessly beating this Black guy who was not supposed to be driving under the influence, but also did not deserve to be beat in this way. Um, and it was actually caught on tape. It was the first time that this was caught on tape, right? So now the world could actually see, oh, these things that young people and people in these neighborhoods are talking about, they're not just making this up because we see an example somehow, some way, somebody taped this beating and it got out. And so Rodney King was taken to the hospital. I believe he was arrested for driving under the influence, but then he bonded out and he took the LA Police Department to court. Got a lawyer, took them to court, and there was a long court case, I think for about a year and a half, about this case, this police brutality case in Los Angeles up until about 1991 to 1992. When the verdict finally came in, the verdict came in and they found the police officers who were caught on tape beating this man. They found them not guilty on all charges. I don't remember exactly what the charges were, but they were found not guilty. And so it made a lot of people upset. Of course, it made the people in the African American community in Los Angeles upset, but it made people across the country upset. Many Black people were upset. Many minorities, racial minorities were upset. And a lot of white people were upset because they felt that this was an injustice. It was very clear that this man was not fighting back, that the man did not, that he did not pose a threat to the police officers. And I believe it was about 4 or 5 police officers who were beating on this one man while he was on the ground. They were hitting him with their batons. And again, you can see this on the video link. And so because there was so much anger and so much upset, and ultimately despair in the African American community, there was a riot. It was called the LA riots, and you can Google this. The LA riots, I believe, of 1992, where almost, I would say maybe a quarter of Los Angeles was burnt to the ground, and people were extremely upset, and they were burning down buildings and burning police cars and burning stores, and LA burned for maybe about a day or two during that riot, and eventually the military had to be called to quelch it down, but it was considered to be one of the worst riots, one of the worst rebellions in modern U.S. history. And it was due to the unfair treatment of this Black man, and it was due to the lack of justice that was done, that was caught on tape, that was provided to this gentleman. And so, in response to this, not Dr. King, Rodney King was being interviewed in the media by the news. And as he was being interviewed, he famously said, "Can't we all just get along?" Right? Those were his kind of famous words. "Can't we all just get along?" And that kind of tagline has been applied to Rodney King since that incident. And so we have this idea of can't we all just get along from this incident, and although this incident is highly racialized, right? It's highly racialized. There's a class element to this where you have this Black man who was in a nice neighborhood driving a certain type of car. So you have a class element, you have a place element. There are all of these factors involved in why this happened. And I think this is a good way to kind of start a conversation around sex, race, and class. It is a good way to kind of frame this conversation around why do these things happen to certain people? What exists and what type of inequalities and what type of disparities apply to certain people, whether they are of a different sex, whether they are of a different sexual identity, whether they are of a different social class, or whether they are of a different race, or whether they are immigrants or Native people. How do these things play a role in treatment? How do these things play a role in access to resources? And at the end of the day, we see impartiality all over the world. We see unfair treatment all over the world. We see how these things occur, how these things happen, and it leads all of us to ask the question or make the statement that Rodney King made, can't we all just get along? So we start our conversation in that way, and that leads us to our next slide, this introduction. And if we look at it, we see that it says, in a society where groups are different from one another, you may have diversity, but with it comes inequality. And so, although this was a very high profile, racialized issue in the 1990s, social problems related to race, related to gender, and related to social class are common in society. And your book starts out and it actually talks about the way that gay Irish Americans were left out of St. Patrick's Day, right? The St. Patrick's Day parade in certain cities. And it kind of starts with that, in looking at this notion of can't we all just get along? And again, whether we're talking about sexual identity or whether we're talking about race, this is a statement that I think really sums up the questions and the comments and the conundrums that exist in sociology, which is the perspective that we're using to discuss sex, race, and class. And so in this chapter, we see the language, the perspective, and the conceptual framework that we will use to start discussing how these situations occurred, where they come from, how do we navigate and address them. And it also lets us know how we can think about these conflicts in ways that can help us put an end to them, in ways that can help us understand that in the present day, we often address these issues by implementing and propagating ideas related to diversity and combating behaviors related to inequality by discussing them head on. And that's what we're going to do in this class. We are going to talk about these problems head on and discuss them not so that we can perpetuate them, but so that we can find solutions, right? At first, we want to give a voice to people that go through these things, and then talk about ways in which we could bring about solutions for people, regardless of your race or your gender or your sexual identity or your class or any of those things. Find ways to find solutions to these problems. So anybody from any specific discipline, again, can look at these issues from many different ways. If you're a psychologist, you can look at it from a mental or mental health standpoint. If you are a political scientist, you can look at this from the notion of politics, right? And how does government and how does the rule of law play a role in how these things are perpetuated? However, I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to look at this from a sociological standpoint. And sociologists, what we do is we utilize what we call a social constructionist perspective. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. But when I say that I'm a sociologist or we're looking at this from a sociological perspective, we're talking about the discipline of sociology, which is the systematic study of human society. It is the study of human behavior from a societal standpoint, not just human behavior individually, though we do though we do look at some things from an individual perspective. That is more so anthropology. Sorry. Ooh. Anthropology. Anthropology is kind of looks at people individually, but also looks at cultures, right? Cultural groups, which again is something sociology does as well. But sociology takes on a much more scientific approach in how we look at societies as a whole and groups, right? So racial groups, class groups, gendered groups, placed groups, religious groups, educational groups. And so we look at the groupings of these people in a society and look at how society treats them and how those people function in society. And so that is how we understand these issues. And if you look at sociology, if you look at anthropology, if you look at psychology, we're all cousins of each other, if you will. But there are some differences, right? in the ways in which we approach these social problems. And so when we say we look at things from a systematic standpoint, essentially when we say systematic, we just mean that in this academic field, we use the scientific method to develop theories and knowledge about the topics that we're talking about. So we're not just speaking haphazardly. We're not just speaking based on our own myopic experiences, but we are talking about these things from the notion of finding a problem, stating a problem, having a hypothesis, collecting data, making sure that it meets the requirements of the scientific method, and coming to logical conclusions that can be either retested or applied in a different way. So with that being said, again, we talked about, if we go to the next slide, we talked about this notion of social construction. And the social constructionist perspective can be seen from both a macro and a micro level. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but it can be seen from a wide lens, but then it can also be seen on a very individual micro lens. So we'll talk about that in a second. But when we say social construction, really what we mean is that human beings give meaning to the world around them, right? So that's what we mean when we say that these ideas are socially constructed, okay? So for example, right, if I were to do this, what does that mean, right? That means either hello, right, I'm greeting you, or goodbye, right? One of those two things. If I do this, right? If I were to give you a rose, what does that mean? Right? More than likely, it means that I like you. There is some interest, maybe some romantic interest, or that there's just some care, right? There could just be some care, some love that is shown to you, which is why I give you a rose. Number three, if you see a ring on your left hand, on the finger next to the pinky, if you see a ring on that finger, what does that mean? That typically means that somebody's married, right? So these are very small examples, but all of these are symbols, right? We call it in sociology symbolic interactionism, but these are symbols of much larger meanings in society. Now, this is very important in US society, but maybe in another society that may not mean greetings or hello or goodbye. Waving might mean something else. That's because in that place, in that culture, that symbol is constructed differently based on the people within that society. In America or in the United States, waving at somebody is constructed to mean hello or goodbye, right? So that is a socially constructed action. So that's what we mean when we say these things are socially constructed. It just means that ideas around meanings within society are created by the people. And therefore, those meanings can stay the same or those meanings can differ. Now, when we talk about socialization, the process by which we learn our society's cultural roles and expectations, what we are saying is that we are socialized in various ways. We are socialized and we are taught how to function within our society. You had to learn that this means hello or this means goodbye. You didn't just wake up and all of a sudden know that, but you knew that based on what you have learned over time, right? You know that based on somebody either telling you or you were just socialized, right? Over time, you learned or you saw somebody receive a rose from somebody they cared about. And then you learned, oh, okay, this is very important. If I receive a rose from someone, then that means something, okay? So we are socialized, and this is just the way in which we're taught what things mean in our society. And we're going to apply that to sex and race and class because all of these things, we're socialized to believe certain things related to race, related to social class, and how money and how status plays a role in society and the way people are identified in society, but also sex and the way in which sex, gender, and all of these things play a role in our society and how we are socialized to apply meaning to certain ideas and behaviors related to sex and gender. So with that being said, I want us to look at this activity. It's called flushing out. And for the next few minutes, we're just going to kind of discuss this encounter that tells us a lot about society, right? And what happens in our society when we are socialized. So what I want you to do is I want you to click on this. And when you click on this, I want you to scroll down. I want you to scroll down and I want you to go to the first diagram where you see a line that's a door, and then you see like three rectangles, and those three rectangles will kind of mean uh, kind of give us a certain meaning as it pertains to using the bathroom. And so if you look at these diagrams, you see that there's this first diagram, and the question that is asked is if somebody walks in, let's say you're walking into a male bathroom, right? And if you walk into a male bathroom, you have to use the restroom. And there's somebody who is using the first one, the one that is closest to the door. You have three urinals, and somebody's using the first one that's closest to the door. Which urinal would you use? Which urinal would you go to if you're a male using this bathroom? Okay. Some people, most people will probably say you would use the one furthest away, right? Leaving one urinal between yourself and the other person, right? So that is, well, actually, sorry, that's not the first one. The first one is when you're using the bathroom, which urinal do you use, right? You're going to use more than likely the one that is furthest from the bathroom, furthest from the door. That's the one that you're going to use because that's the one that we're taught that you are supposed to use because that's the cleanest, right? And then I believe the second one is the one where if you walk into a bathroom and there is somebody that is at the urinal closest to the door, or either at the one furthest from the door, which one are you going to use? And you're going to use the one that puts you in between those two urinals, right? There's one in between those two to give you that space. But then the third one that's asked in this activity is if you walk into the bathroom and there's somebody using the furthest from the urinal and also the one that is near the door, what do you do? And some people say you just wait, even though there's a urinal right there, right? Some people say, I'll just wait until one of them is available, or I might just go ahead and use it, but then maybe I'll look up or close my eyes or whatever. So while I'm using the restroom. Now, the interesting thing about this is not necessarily that there are these rules, so-called rules of using the bathroom, but that we all knew what those rules were. Even though we come from various places, various maybe cities or states, we all have different backgrounds, whether it's race or whether it's class or whether it's gender. We all have different understandings and different beliefs, and we come from all different places. But we all knew what the rules were when it comes to using the bathroom, particularly the male bathroom. Even if you don't identify as a male, you still knew what the rules were. And it goes to show that socialization is a real thing. How did you even know these rules? How did you know what bathroom you're supposed to use and which ones you're not supposed to use at what time? Did you read a manual? Did you go to school to learn these things? No, you didn't. You just learned over time. Why? Because you were socialized in this way. And that's what we mean when we say the socialization process. The socialization process is the process by which we understand how to navigate society. And so if we go to the next slide where it says social structure, we see that it says the institutions that make up society and teach us the way that we should behave, that is what we call social structure or social institutions. So for example, when we look at this topic, we see that we have, for example, family, religious authorities, organizations, economic arrangement, political powers, and mass media. All of these things are structures. All of these things are essentially institutions that teach us how we should behave, right? Some of the first things we learn about what it means to be a boy or what it means to be a girl or what it means to be a male or a female or whatever we are, right? However we identify, or who we are as children, babies, toddlers, children's, young adults. We learn these things from family, right? We learn these things from school. There are lessons and ways of being that are taught to young girls when they go to school. Make sure you sit with your legs crossed. Or you're taught boys to go to school. Make sure that you open the door for a young lady. Things we're taught. Make sure you raise your hand before you begin speaking, or don't interrupt someone when they're talking. So there are just ways in which we understand how we should behave, but it's not just even in family and school. If you go to church or if you go to a mosque or any type of religious affiliation that you may have, that also teaches you how to behave. If you go to a Christian church, you probably learn how to behave by following a set of rules called the Ten Commandments. Or if you're Muslim, you probably learned how to behave and what you should do as a Muslim by reading the Quran and by studying the 5 pillars of Islam. If you were raised Jewish, then you may understand how you should behave or what your life should be like based on the Torah. So there are these different mediums in which we understand behavior, which we understand the rules and regulation of everyday life. We understand it through the mediums of these commands or rules or laws, right? But then also it may be organizations that we may be a part of, or economic arrangements, or even political powers. How we should behave or how we should think or how society should function could also exist based on our political affiliation. If you're independent, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if you're a conservative, if you're a liberal, all of these different things, right? Also dictate how we believe we should behave and how we believe society should behave. And then definitely mass media, what we see on social media. What are the proper things to say or not say? What is the proper verbiage? What is considered to be politically correct and what is considered to be taboo? All of these things we learn from media, right? Also, when we talk about social construction, going to the next slide, we also see that social construction changes with time because what is important at one time or what has meaning at one time doesn't necessarily have that same meaning in another time. So, for example, if we were living in 1824, how would you define and describe a woman? We were in 1824 US society. for those of you who are history buffs like myself, you can kind of picture and see, like, okay, what was happening in 1824? Well, first, there were enslaved people, right? There were what America or American textbooks or textbooks call slaves, but enslaved people. African people were enslaved. Okay. You also, this was maybe about 30, no, maybe about 50 years after um, the the American Revolution. So it's a very um, uh, very it's a baby country. It's a very young country. If this is shortly before Andrew Jackson is president. This was during the Indian Removal Act, if you know about all these things, where the Native Americans were pushed off to lands in the West, out of lands in the Southeast. We still have a lot of colonies, but not a lot of states. It's still very much part of the Eastern Seaboard is where most of the states existed. Um, Women didn't have rights. Most people were still agrarian. This is at the very beginning of the American Revolution. Not American Revolution, sorry, Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution. Um, so things were still very much about farming, but we're just now starting to kind of use machines, right, to do things, right? I think the cotton gin may have just been invented at this time. So kind of gives us a picture of what life is like. Now we can answer this question. How would you define and describe a woman? And if we were in public, if we were not in public, but if we were in person, some of you may say, oh, well, a woman is probably somebody who has a husband, right? You weren't really something until you had a husband. If you were a woman in 1824, if you were single, it's not good. No man wants to marry you. Yeah, you need to find a husband. So that's number one. You weren't somebody unless you were attached to somebody, unless you had a husband. And definitely you had to have some children. Once you got married, immediately you were supposed to start having children. So a woman is someone who's married and someone who is a mother, right? Um, Also, a woman worked in the house. A woman did not have a job. A woman was not highly educated. That was not what women were supposed to do during that time. A woman is supposed to take care of her husband and take care of the children, and that is it. And the more children she has, and the better she can take care of them and the husband, the better type of woman she was. And that was pretty much what defined and described a woman. And she wore long dresses and she was meek and mild and did not speak a lot and did not speak on political issues or social issues. There was very little freedom that a woman really had during that time. And that's just if you were a white woman. If you were a woman, a Native American woman or a black woman, then you were property. Especially if you were a black woman, you were property, or if you were a Native American woman, um, you were not a part of U.S. society in the traditional sense, right? There was a special set of laws created for you. But if you were a black woman, you weren't even a human, you were property. And so that was how a woman was described, right? Now, let's go 100 years and I ask you that same question. Let's say we're in a classroom and now it's 1924. How would you define and describe a woman? Well, slightly different now, right? Because now this is after 1919. If you know anything about 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, and the 19th Amendment gave women the what? The right to vote. So now women have more say in 1924 than they did in 1824. Also, this is the time of the flappers, right? If you know anything about the jazz age, this is the time of the flappers. So now women have a little bit more freedom, and now they're expressing themselves in different ways. Young women are wearing short dresses. They're dancing to jazz music. You don't necessarily have to be married to be successful or to be seen as somebody. However, it's still very much a status symbol to be married or to have a man next to you. However, depending on what city you lived in, if you lived in the north or if you lived in a big city, there were spaces where you could have a same-sex relationship, and for the most part, people might leave you alone. But that was not common in 95% of the US. But in those bigger cities, in these very small areas, same-sex relationships were tolerable, right? So you didn't necessarily have to have a husband. Um, uh, but it was not very common for women to seek higher education or seek jobs that made a lot of money. And if you wanted to do most things, have a business, get a job, get opportunities, get credit, any of those things, you still had to have a man next to you. Um, so this is how a woman was defined and described in 1924. And now let's jump to 2024. Let's jump to 2026, right? Um, if we jump to 2024, let's say 2026, you see now how will we define and describe a woman? Very different. A little over 100 years later. Now, a woman, now gender is not necessarily how you were born. Gender can now be how you identify, right? And now that is something that society continues to grapple with. That is something that is an idea that society and different people within society tend to negotiate, right? And what that means, because now gender is it can be transitioning outside of how a person is born versus what a person is and who they are, right? And so these type of conversations are now had. Now, women do have the right to vote. Women can get jobs. Women can get higher education. Now, there are certain groups of women that are more educated as a group than men. So now how a woman is socially constructed in 2024 or 2026 is very different from how they were 100 years prior to that and 100 years prior to that, which again is an example of social construction. How we look at these ideas are based on how society constructs them, not only by the people, but also by the timing. So, timing in another 100 years, being a woman can mean something very different from what it means now. Why? Because it is a concept that is socially constructed. Now, if we go to the next slide, we see that there is this notion called essentialism or biological determinism. And this is the idea that there's a set of attributes which are necessary to gender and its function. So when we say these essentialist ideas, essentially what we're talking about, essentialist ideas, essentially, what we're discussing is we're saying that if there is a certain gender or identity that applies to you, then that comes with a certain set of behaviors or skills. That comes with a certain set of attributes. Meaning, if you are a woman or a girl, then you are supposed to be nurturing. You are supposed to be quiet. You are supposed to be smart, but you use your intelligence to help build your family. If you are a man or a boy, you are supposed to be a leader, and you're supposed to be aggressive, and you're supposed to be tough, and you are supposed to build things and create things, and you're supposed to be a change maker, right? In a way that shows that you are no nonsense. You're supposed to be kind of mean, right? These are the things that we're told based on these essentialist ideas. Biological determinism says biology determines the type of attributes and the type of person that you are. And this has historically led to disparities based on gender. This has historically led to even college presidents saying that a girl or a female student should not necessarily have as much access to the math department or to the science department as a male student because men are just naturally better at math than women. They're made to do this because they are the ones that will lead in technology, right? So these are essentialist or biological deterministic ideas. Remember, we talked about micro and macro level perspectives. These are the perspectives that we use when we are discussing sociology and when we are discussing social constructions like sex, race, and class. And so we will use athletics as an example, right? When we look at things from a micro level standpoint, we look at things from an individual, from a way that reflects individual circumstances. So, how many of you were or are an athlete, right? Um, how many of you were good? Some people may have been athletes, but they may not have been very good. So how many of you were good at your sport? Okay. Um, on an individual level, why do you think you were a good athlete? Something to think about. Why were you a good athlete? Were you good because you worked hard? You trained? Were you good because you ate well? You ate a balanced diet? You ate your protein, your vegetables, your carbs, your dairy. Were you good because you worked out? Because you ran, even when you didn't want to, and you hit the weight room, even when you didn't want to? Were you good because you were disciplined? Maybe you focused. Um, were you good because you went to practice when other people decided they didn't want to go? You ran your routes. You trained. You did your all the things that you were supposed to do. Maybe that's why you were good. And that's a micro level perspective, right? And it could very well be true. All those things can absolutely contribute to why you were good as an athlete. Now, on my macro level perspective, that refers to the structural levels and social institutions that shape our rules, powers, policies, and our realities. So now, same question, but now let's look at it from a macro perspective. On a structural level, meaning things that were beyond your control, why were you so good? Think about things beyond your control. You can control how you eat to a degree. You can talk about that. But you can control when you practice. You can control how often you train. You can control the work you put in. But what were some things about being a good athlete that you couldn't control? And maybe you might say, you can't control who your coach is. Maybe you had a coach in school if you went to public school, and that was just your coach. But if you needed private lessons, if you needed a really, really, really good coach that gave private lessons, that coach probably cost money because now they're giving you lessons just for you. They're taking time away from their schedule, and that means that's going to cost you. And if your parents had the money for that, that's great. Now that's beyond your control. You can't control how much money your parents make, but if they made good money, they could pay somebody to teach you the things that you needed to learn privately so that you can be a good athlete. Why were you good at a specific sport? Could have been because that specific sport may or may not have required a lot of money, right? Let's say basketball. Basketball is low cost. Basketball, jersey, shorts. That's a basketball court and all over the place. You can learn, you can get good at that with low money. My daughter's in gymnastics. That can get expensive, right? Because now you have leotards. Now you have gymnastics is something that's a little more expensive. Golf, that's a little more expensive, right? Certain sports may require, to a degree, higher social class, right? That's beyond your control. If you're able to if your parents are able to get off of work and take you to practice or take you to games that are or matches that are away from the city that you live in, that's beyond your control. If you have parents or maybe only one parent works and the other parent can take you, that's a privilege. But not everybody has that. In some families, there may only be one parent, or both parents are working. So there's nobody to take you to the games or take you to the matches in different places. And so you may not get as good as some of the others who have more experience. So now we're looking at things from a macro standpoint, because now this isn't just about the work that you put in, it's also about the opportunities that you have. And the opportunities that you have are not, you're not in control of that. That's just how your life is. So if you have opportunities, a lot of opportunities, well, you should be grateful. That's good. Some people don't have them. And so they have to do other things in order to have the things that they want. But that is how we look at things from a macro standpoint. And that standpoint is typically what we use in sociology. So when we talk about sociology, one thing we talk about is developing what we call a sociological imagination. And this concept was formulated by a man named C. Wright Mills. And C. Wright Mills says that our sociological imagination is a mindset that allows people to see how social forces can shape one's life story or biography. It is the quality of mind that helps people think about what is going on in the world and what may be happening with them on a personal level. And so when we talk about sociological imagination, we talk about our lives, but we're not just talking about our lives, but we're also talking about the things that are happening around us that influence our lives. So if you came up, right, many of you are younger, and so you may have gone to high school or gone to college during the pandemic, right? You are coming up during a global pandemic. You're right, you're young or you're a teenager during a global pandemic. That shapes the way you look at life. That's important. That's an important part of your biography. If you were to write your story down, you couldn't leave that part out. And that's not something that you could control. It just happened. But you could not leave that part out of something that you were writing about yourself. Now, me, I was older during the pandemic. Still very important, still impactful, but it would have been different if I was a teenager during the pandemic and I had to go to high school or I had to go to college during a global pandemic. It's a very different understanding, right? And so the things that happen around us in our lives, whether they're happening to us or happening just in society, that along with our own individual lives, that's our sociological imagination. Who you are and how you were born that you can't control. If you were born a boy or a girl, right? Or if you have a different gendered identity and what that means, or the family that you were born into, or the race that you were born into, or the class that you were born into. If you were born into with a family that has money or has privilege, or family that doesn't, or maybe a family kind of in the middle. Those are things you can't control, but they play a role in who you are. And that's what the sociological imagination is. It says all these things that are happening around you, in addition to your own life and how you choose to live and how you choose to function every day, is all a part of, and it all shapes your perspective on society. And it allows for us to understand the differences between troubles and issues. A trouble is something that happens to us individually. An issue is something that happens to people that look like you or that have the same social positioning as you altogether. So for example, if I came to you and I said, I can't find a job, something is wrong. Can you help me find a job? What should I do? You may say, oh, well, maybe you should change your resume, or maybe you should look here, or maybe you should create a better LinkedIn page, or maybe you should do these different things. Maybe you got to go back to school and get another degree. Maybe you need to get more experience. Maybe you need to become an apprentice. Maybe you need to do some of these things that can help you be better in the job force, be a better contender. Now, what if I told you, my social position is that I'm an African American male, right? From Florida, right? And what if I said, well, me, and there were 99 other people that looked like me in terms of our social, the African American males, and none of us can find jobs. And we have different degree types, we come from different places, we have different personalities, but none of us can find a job. Well, the first thing was a trouble where I could just change my LinkedIn page or get a better um, look in different places for a job, and maybe that will help. That's a trouble. If I bring you 99 other people, so now you got 100 Black men that can't find jobs and they all have different education levels, well, now that seems like an issue. There could be some discrimination happening because there's no reason why all these people of one particular group should not be able to access a basic need like a job to be able to take care of their families. So you have troubles and you have issues. Troubles are individual and issues are societal. And we understand the difference between these troubles and issues when we use our sociological imagination. So going back to Can't We All Just Get Along with Rodney King, if this was individual trouble where this one man who was essentially accosted and assaulted by the police, if that just happened to him, I don't think that the people of Los Angeles and the people around the country would have been as upset at the justice system in Los Angeles or at the police department in Los Angeles if it had just happened that one time to that one individual. But because police brutality was and is not just an individual issue, but individual trouble, but it is a societal issue that happens across states, across cultures in many ways. And it happens in many places, and it has happened for decades. That is why the people responded in the way that they did, because it was not just an individual trouble, but it was a societal issue that was specific. It's not specific to that city, but they had seen and had enough of it. And so now there is this backlash, right? So that's how you see the difference between individual troubles and societal issues. And so as we near the end, we see that another thing that we talk about when we talk about the sociological imagination and the sociological perspective of these things is the group memberships that we use to define ourselves. And so we all are members of groups, right? We're all members of groups, whether a racial group, a class group, a gender group, a religious group. And there are stereotypes and sometimes generalizations that we are used to describe people in those groups, right? And some of them are positive, some of them are negative, but all stereotypes aren't necessarily good, right? Stereotypes are overgeneralized beliefs that describe an entire group of people. So, for example, if somebody were to say that Jews are cheap, or that Black men are criminal, or that gay men are feminine, or that white people can't dance, or the myth of the model minority that all Asians are smart. All of these are stereotypes. These are generalizations that people use to describe people. And whether it's positive or negative, they're wrong because all people of a specific group are not one way. We're all diverse and we're all very different, right? Generalizations describe a general pattern or tendency of a group. So we can talk about generalizations or a general pattern. For example, there's a pattern that Black people are more likely to be incarcerated than white people. That's not a stereotype. That is a scientific pattern that we see in our society, right? There's a pattern that we are less likely to see a white sprinter with the gold than a sprinter of color, right? That is a pattern. It doesn't mean that there are no white sprinters. It doesn't mean that there are any white sprinters that are faster that have won the gold. But this is something that we can see, right? Mexican immigrants are more likely to be deported than any other immigrant group. That is a pattern that we see, right? It's not a stereotype. Stereotypes are over a generalization, right, that we see. Or generalization that we use lazily to describe a group. But then when we say generalization, we're typically talking about scientific patterns or observational patterns. And so as we conclude, we see that our solution is that First thing is that diversity is not just about having different people in a place, but the treatment and meaning of these people in the place that matters. And that there is a difference between inclusion and assimilation. When you include people, you include all of who a person is, and you don't try to change them. They can be fully who they are. You can be fully who you are, and you can exist harmoniously. When you assimilate, then you take a person who is different, you bring them on and you bring them into your society, but make them change to fit what you want them to be. And that's not inclusion, that's assimilation. And that's not always positive. And very rarely it can be positive, right? And so, how groups interact and get along with each other's differences versus how groups adopt the dominant culture is the difference between inclusion versus assimilation. And so, we're going to talk about this diversity in various ways in sex and race and class and uh, love and religion and gender and all these different ways. And these are some of the things that we're going to discuss to help us talk about some of the conundrums that exist within our society. So with that being said, if there are any additional assignments this week, you need to go ahead and complete them. Also, don't forget to complete the syllabus and class information quiz and to introduce your self-discussion if those things are there as well. Make sure you complete those, okay? I hope all is well. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to talking with you later for our next discussion. Have a great day.